Good evening, everyone. My name is Bob Mitchell. I am the Superintendent of Schools in the Cumberland School Department, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to this referendum forum. And Senator Ryan Pearson and I are going to be presenting some information that we hope is really helpful in your understanding of this, what is being referred to as a once-in-a-generation opportunity. So hopefully we're going to be able to share with you all of the reasons why this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And we also want to make sure that we're going to do a presentation, the two of us, and then we're going to provide you all an opportunity to ask any questions that you feel are important, not only for you to know, but I'm sure that there are other folks who would be thinking the same thing. So please, when we get to that part of the presentation, do not hesitate to ask any questions. So one of the most important things I think that we can do, and one of the things that we have been trying to do as a school department, is to raise everyone's awareness around this opportunity. I'm sure you all have heard that there is a $250 million state bond referendum that voters will be voting on November 6th. And there is also an $83 million Cumberland school bond referendum that the taxpayers in Cumberland will be voting on as well. And it's important that that $250 million referendum passes in order for us to take advantage of the $83 million. So, as I just mentioned, on November 6th, voters in Cumberland are going to be voting on two bond questions. One is the $250 million statewide bond referendum, and Cumberland residents will be voting on the $83 million bond referendum, and we're going to be providing a whole lot of information about that $83 million and really get to the root of why this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Senator.
So history is always important, and we wanted to sort of go back in time a little bit to sort of how did we get here, and certainly not only in Cumberland but also from a statewide perspective. Back in 2008-9, there was a statewide moratorium put on all school construction given a lot of the recession and what was happening in the economy and state revenues plummeting. That period of time really started, we weren't investing necessarily what we should have been in schools before that, and certainly when that moratorium came on, that really crammed down construction all across the state on schools. So in 2013 and 14, the Senate actually had a task force that began meeting, began looking at the problem. We brought in experts from all across the country around who has sort of the best model on how to handle school construction. And really, there wasn't that many states that had a great model, but the closest one was Massachusetts in having a really strong model. So the Senate made a series of recommendations that we issued in 2014 around different steps that we should take. And in 2015, when Governor Raimondo came into office, we actually found a partner to work with us on that. And with her in her first budget, we actually lifted the moratorium, which was really important, and allowed the existing sort of program to be alive and allow some of those basic things to happen. But before we went further, one of the key problems that we had as state policymakers was we had no true understanding of what the need. We all knew that our schools needed work and that they needed repair, but we didn't know that Cumberland High School needed a new boiler in 3 years. And so it made it very difficult for us to plan from an expense standpoint if I don't even know what's broken or what needs to be fixed. And so in that 2015 budget article, we lifted the moratorium to allow things to start to come back through, but we also mandated something that's now being called the Jacobs Report, which essentially was a full statewide audit done in a consistent way of all of our school buildings to really get a good assessment on what needed to be done statewide. That report was then released in 2017 and is really the foundation for the financing plans that we ended up developing on the state level. So what did the Jacobs report tell us? So the Jacobs report basically said across the state there's about 2.2 billion in deficiencies. And so you can see on the right-hand side of this chart, it sort of breaks down what those different sorts of issues are, and you can see that it breaks into different categories. And so there's the 600 million is the safe, warm, and dry that you typically hear about. There were 54 million in what they called priority one, and there's hundreds of pages and backup documents that sit behind this, but it was a significant level of work that was done to truly help not only the state understand, but each individual community understand where their deficiencies were and how they would need to address them. And so that was done then, and Cumberland got a good piece of our insight from that, and so I'll let Superintendent Mitchell talk about Cumberland's impact.
So the Jacobs report identified $58 million worth of what are called current deficiencies. And let me go back. I want to show you this picture. See this, and I think this picture is a good example of one of the deficiencies that has to be addressed. This is actually the boiler system in this building. And these are the boilers that were, built or a part of the original high school when it was built. So as you can imagine, it is not energy efficient. We have done some work in the district in putting in new boilers in a number of schools. In fact, we have boilers going in right now at B.F. Norton, fired up this week for the first time, new boilers there, and new boilers at Garvin Elementary School, and I hope as we speak those boilers are working today. So they're brand new, and they are probably a third of the size of what you see here. So this is a good example of one of those deficiencies, just one example of the work that needs to be done. So we know that when everything passes and we're able to address issues like energy efficient issues like the boilers in the high school, we know that not only are we going to get more energy efficient boilers, but it's also going to save us some money. So I think that is a really good example of what needs to be done. Another example, and I'm probably going to mention this a couple of times, but I think it's one of those things that's worth repeating. And there are lots and lots of things that need to be addressed. But here's another example of deficiencies. There are two of our elementary schools, and I've talked about this in our PTO meetings, in our meetings where we've talked about the referendum. Both Garvin and Community School have cafeterias that are so small that they have to have, both schools have 6 lunches every day. They need 6 lunches to accommodate all of the students who go to that school. So they literally start school at 9 o'clock or so, and they start lunches at 10:30 in order to accommodate feeding all of the students and staff in the building. So one of the things that we know has to happen is, and this is something that we can all, those of us who have children at Community School or Garvin School, is something that we can relate to. Who would argue that we need cafeterias that are probably twice the size as the cafeterias we have now in those 2 locations? So those are really good examples of the kinds of deficiencies that need to be addressed. And another example is in probably all 8 of our buildings, I would say at least 90% or more of our buildings, there's no question that the windows need to be replaced. The windows in our buildings were also put in when those buildings were built. They're not energy efficient, and I have actually been in classrooms where windows don't even open. So we have a responsibility to address that issue by putting in more energy efficient windows. And those are just 2 really brief examples of the kinds of issues that need to be addressed.
So the question is sort of, what was happening before in the old program and kind of what's changing now. And so the old program that we had reimbursed communities sort of at the bond payment stage, right? So you got approval for the work, you knew there'd be a state share for that, and then there'd be a bond payment. And when that bond payment was due, the state would start reimbursing you at whatever your percentage is. That's sort of the old program, and a couple challenges with that, right? It required the communities to bond the full amount of the work that they were doing rather than what they're truly paying, which, depending on how well it was communicated, and it's one of the things we'll talk about here tonight, is often could mislead voters. And so voters would say, oh, geez, $50 million, in Pawtucket, I'm worried about us being able to repay that $50 million. Well, if the state was paying $40 million of that and it was $10 million, it may have changed the voters' aspect of that. And so the way in which those shares were positioned was sort of misleading to voters often. It often also drove a higher interest cost. So I won't bore you with all the financing behind it, but it would dramatically increase sort of the overall cost to actually issue that debt. The other problem with that program is the scale of that program and the size of what we're doing just simply is not enough. We started with a $2.2 billion number, and having that program, which has been about $80 million a year of bond payments, is just not sizable enough to be able to handle the amount of work that we as a state need to do. The other issues were that we had sort of no universal building standards and we had no maintenance requirements. And so the state would basically say, well, when the building's broken enough or it's in disrepair enough and you need to replace it or you need to do a major renovation, come to us and we'll help you pay those costs. But as ongoing maintenance went on, the state had no active and engaged role in that. And so it sort of created this bad incentive, right, to wait until things were so bad you had to have to do a big bond. And that's certainly something we did not want to continue to create. And the other part about this is, if we waited and if we sort of did everything under the old program and the old plan, cost of fixing things is going up, right? So the longer we wait, the worse condition different deficiencies are going to get into, and the higher the cost of fixing those deficiencies are really going to drive that. And so we wanted to make sure that we fully reformed the system. So how does this sort of work? So typically and historically speaking, Cumberland has received around a 40% reimbursement rate on work that we have done. Our base rate right now is 45%, so there's an equation that basically comes up with a base rate. It's 45%. And so with these projects that we're envisioning and with the incentives we'll walk you through in just a second, Cumberland could get up to 65% reimbursement. So the difference between that, right, the 45 and the 65, is about $17 million. And thanks for the math. I needed to learn how to do that. So it's a significant savings to the town, right? And so there's a huge portion of that that is just in the incentives. The second piece, though, that makes it really important is the actual financing up front. And so with the $250 million, some of those funds, rather than waiting until the bonds are issued and the payments are made, some of those funds can actually be provided up front to the community. And if the funds are provided up front, it's less money you have to borrow, less interest expense, less overall total costs for both the town and the state. And so that's really sort of the basic structure of the plan and of the idea. So Superintendent Mitchell used the word, once in a generation opportunity, and I think that's a true statement. I don't think anybody has ever seen this level of reimbursement for anything happening in Cumberland. And I have to just say, my colleague Senator Picard is here, but also the members of our House delegation, Rep. McLaughlin, Ackerman, Phillips, Marzakowski, all were incredibly instrumental in making sure that Cumberland got a good deal. Right? And I think that's something that we often hear, Providence is getting reimbursed at these high rates and, other communities are. We really had to advocate and fight to make sure that Cumberland received just as much of a bonus, or actually more of an advantageous bonus than some of those urban communities. And, as the senator represents Cumberland and Lincoln, that's a good thing for us. And so, the way the incentives are structured, Providence actually has less to gain in these incentives than we do, because we're picking up 20 points more. At maximum, they're picking up probably 4 or 8 points, something like that. So it's the way it's structured, it disproportionately really encourages the suburban communities to take action. And so we were really happy to do that and make sure we drove this home. What's the purpose of the incentives? The purpose of the incentive is to drive activity in the incentive areas, which we'll go through in a minute, but also to really catalyze communities to act. And that is the biggest reason to do it, is the state, we could have put this program out there and said, we're going to do this, but without those incentives and without them being healthy enough, like a 20% reimbursement rate, we wanted to make sure that communities moved fast and got this work done for multiple reasons. We shouldn't have any more days than we need to of people working and going to school in buildings that aren't sufficient, but also there's a real hard cost to the state and to the town for delaying any of that work. So Cumberland moved quickly, and Superintendent Mitchell and I are going to sort of tag team this timeline for you. But I think this is a really important understanding for everyone to understand. And so if you sort of look at this timeline about how we've been moving, Cumberland is one of the fastest moving communities, and I'm personally very proud of that, but it's because of a lot of work by our school committee who did Herculean efforts, our council that worked very hard, Superintendent Mitchell that worked very hard, and our entire state delegation that did this. And so the timeline sort of walks itself out. In January, the governor included within her budget the Jacobs report had come out last year. We knew we needed to do so. All of end of last year and into the fall, there were sort of work groups going on around what's our plan, how are we going to do this, and we're able to reach an agreement at the end of the year. And the governor included that in her budget proposal when she issued that in January. There were a series of hearings and testimony, and of course, we made adjustments to the plan as we went through the hearings. But there's really a lot of simultaneous work going on here. So you can sort of see, the legislative hearings and legislative process taking place March, April, and obviously we were continuing through May and June. But also, in May, the council, as the legislature was talking about it, the council, it passed a resolution in support of the overall state plan. And a lot of the work really started in May. And so in May, through conversations really led by school committee member DeMonica and Councilwoman Bolio, respecting each of their boards, they brought their two boards together to sort of bring a very quick action together to get to the legislature what we needed in time. And so Super Mitchell will talk a little bit about that work.
So, this really was a unified effort, and I just want to, we probably have already mentioned it several times, but I'm going to mention it again, and that is the beauty of this opportunity is that we could get $83 million worth of facilities work done for $29 million if we hit all of those incentives. And just so that you all know, the plan that we developed was designed specifically to ensure that we hit all 4 of those incentive areas. So think about that. Hence the once-in-a-generation opportunity. $83 million worth of facilities work for $29 million. And I think it's important, and the senator, I think, would do a much better job of explaining how the financing will work as we move on. Just a couple of things. We had to really work together. We being the school department, our state legislators, our town council, our school committee, had to work really fast in order to pull this all together. Louis Torrado, our architect, and his associate, Chris Devine, really had to put this on the fast track because And Ryan kept saying that we wanted to be in a position where we would be one of the first districts in the queue to be able to access this money. So town council, school committee, legislators, we had several meetings. Senator Picard attended several of those meetings. So we only had like 2 or 3 weeks to really pull this initial proposal together. And this process also includes other things that we are required to do. So, for example, on September 13th and 14th, we had what is called a visioning session, a 2-day intensive 8 o'clock till 3:30, both days. We had homework. We worked through lunch. It was facilitated by a gentleman who is an educational planner. His name is Frank Locker. In fact, he has led many of these sessions all over the state. But that is something that we're required to do. And the most important thing that we need to accomplish over those 2 days was the guiding question was, what do we want our schools to look like in 10, 20, 30, and 40 years down the road to meet 21st century learning environments? So that was really our focus. And like, how do you know what that is going to be like unless you do a tremendous amount of reading and preparation? So as part of our work as a visioning group, we had homework to do, so we had to read research and lots of articles about the trends in education, not only in facilities, but in the way we go about teaching and learning. I think it's important for everyone to know that we made sure that all of our constituents in the Cumberland School District were represented. We had parents. We, of course, had educators. We had 11 students were involved in that process. They were unbelievable. 5 middle school students, 2 from North Cumberland Middle School, 3 from McCourt Middle School, and we had 6 students from the high school, all actively engaged in this process. So there is a report that is being developed as a result of that work over those 2 days, and we did a lot, so it takes a little time to get that organized, and once that is ready, we'll make sure that we get it out and on the website for everyone to see. I think the one thing that is important for us to mention is that that $83 million proposal that we put together was just an initial proposal. Because we have been paying more attention to the work that needs to be done since that time and have learned more about the work that we need to do in our conversations with our architect and engineers, we may make some changes to that, right? The dollar amount will stay the same, but we might want to focus our attention on some other things. Let me just give you one example, because it's not in the report, but it's something I think that we have a responsibility to consider. Ashton Elementary School is busting at the seams. For some reason, there is a significant number of families with children moving into that homeschool area. So we have a decision to make. That is, and we're at maximum enrollment, by the way, in every school, regardless of the fact that we have a number of students that are going to the charter. So we have a decision to make. Do we want to, because right now Ashton Elementary School is a 2-track school, and what that means is there are 2 kindergarten classes, 2 1s, 2 2s, 2 3s, 2 4s, 2 5s. We need to make a decision. Do we want to make Ashton Elementary School a 3-track school? And if we make Ashton Elementary School a 3-track school, that means we need to add 5 classes. So those are the kinds of decisions that will be made between now and February, which is when the stage 2 deadline has to be met.
I think that's a really important point the superintendent just mentioned, which is the standard sort of process that the Department of Ed from a statewide perspective issues is you begin your application as the stage 1, which is your initial planning. You do sort of these kinds of conversations, and then you go through and you do your stage 2. Once your stage 2 application happens, that's what you're formally submitting for approval and for reimbursement. And then at that point, you have 5 years to actually complete the work. So there's ongoing work. I think those educational planning sessions will happen, and there'll be certainly a lot of work upcoming that I know the superintendent and my colleagues in government and the school committee are very, very excited for. So question really around what are these incentives we keep talking about and why. I think the first thing behind these incentives that's important is they're encouraging things that the state as a policy has said these are the important things for us to consider. So health and safety issues, pretty obvious, right? If there's something that is a health or safety concern, we want to make sure that is addressed and right away. But we also know from an early childhood perspective that there's so much that can be gained from investing more in early childhood education. We want to make sure that we're capitalizing on that, and as a state, we want to prioritize that. career and technical education, a similar piece around as we're thinking about students having successful pathways either to college or career, we need to make sure that we have the facilities that can do that and really make sure that we're preparing students for the workforce. Superintendent Mitchell mentioned overcrowding and underutilized. So underutilized is just as important as overcrowding, right? And so Cumberland, we're at capacity at our elementary schools, but there are many districts throughout the state that are severely under their capacity. And so it certainly doesn't make sense for us to continue to heat and maintain a building that has, space for 300 more students in Warwick, for instance. And so as a state, we wanted to incentivize handling both sides of that issue, which is if you're overcrowded, we want to make sure we provide the appropriate space, but if you have a lot of underutilized space, we want to incent you to shrink and downsize that. And we put money behind it because often, as you know, those can be difficult conversations when a district has to talk about closing schools or anything like that. And then security, right? So obvious reasons, school security is of paramount importance, and we wanted to make sure that we provided the financial resources for districts to take this action. And again, these incentives are, like the sales, limited time only, because they are, and we really want to encourage communities to get out there and take advantage of it. And again, particularly proud that Cumberland is really on the forefront of that. So you might ask, so why are there two questions? I don't, what's the reason? Why is there 250? Why is there 83? Are they the same thing? Are they different, et cetera? So the question one on the statewide ballot is allowing the state to go issue a $250 million worth of bonds. We can't issue more than, it's controlled. There can't be more than $100 million issued in any one budget year, but it gives the authorization for up to 250. And we saw this as the first bond authorization. The state's plan includes two $250 million bond authorizations, and this is, issuance one. And so that bond is meant to provide the state capital to give to cities or towns to be able to do school construction work. It's sort of a upfront cash that the state would have to be able to give to communities. The $83 million is the total of the work that Cumberland wants to complete. And so Cumberland's is a local question only, and it's asking Cumberland voters specifically, are you okay with spending $83 million in renovations on Cumberland schools? And there's a reimbursement piece in that question. And so the idea here is we're getting Cumberland voter approval for doing the full $83 million worth of work. What will then happen is if the Cumberland voters approve, if the school department submits their stage 2 application, the state will say, okay, we have Cumberland's application. They will evaluate it for the incentive ratios, and we believe Cumberland could get up to 65%, which is significant, right? So 69 million of that 83 would be state paid. And so the idea behind that is the state would then say, where do we have money to pay for that state share? The first place they're going to go look is that $250 million worth of capital. And yep. 69, no, it's 65%. So 29's local, right? So $29 million worth of work. $29 million is the local share, right? The remainder of the 83 would be state reimbursed, right? So it's a 65% reimbursement rate, and then a $29 million local share. Does that make sense? Yeah, I hope. Okay. Okay. So the first place the state's going to go look on where they pay the state share off of that is out of the $250 million worth of capital that was approved in that bond. There's also another set of capital money that we have set aside that is available to the state to be able to pay that state share. Whatever the state does not fund up front would be through the old traditional program where the reimbursements would come over time through what we call state housing aid. And so that's when the bond payments are due, the state pays their percentage portion of that bond payment in perpetuity until that bond's paid off. And so it's an important distinction that I think there's a lot of confusion out there around. So wait, there's $250 million available for the whole state, but Cumberland's going to take 83. How's that going to happen? That they're two kind of different things. And so it's sort of really important to understand the mechanics of how that work. But the bottom line is that the $83 million worth of work at the 65% reimbursement rate leaves $29 million for Cumberland taxpayers locally. And the rest would be covered by the state in one of these myriad of ways. the $250 million bond being one of them. It's also really important to mention that the statute, the way it's written for all the incentives, is structured in a way that it requires question 1 to pass for any of the incentives to be possible. So question 1 has to pass, or the whole game is over, basically, right? There's no incentives, there's no capital money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important that voters understand that it's 2 questions and both are equally important. All right.
So I think it's important for people to have some understanding of the work that's actually going to be done. So I'm sure people are thinking, okay, so 83 million, what are we going to see when that $83 million, if everything works according to plan, is provided that opportunity to Cumberland? And there are definitely things that you're going to be able to see, and there are things that you aren't going to be able to see. So, for example, there are teachers in this building who have never seen the boilers, right? So boilers, who would argue that energy efficient boilers, replacing the boilers now with energy efficient boilers isn't the right thing to do, right? So, and that costs a lot of money, right? So $500,000 just on the actual boilers themselves. But it's something that we have to do, and over the long run it will save the taxpayers money. But then, and then there are things like univents. One of the things that I noticed on the list of things that has to be done in the high school, since we're in the high school as an example, is $2 million worth of univent work. So that is the heating and ventilation system that is in every classroom in this building, actually in every room in this building. Those need to be replaced because they were a part of the original construction. So same thing. Energy efficient univents, which we've already done at both McCourt and North Cumberland. We need to do the same thing here. $2 million just for that. Which brings me to a really important point. One of the things that we asked Torado Associates to do for us, and Chris Devine did this work, he identified a list of all of the projects that are going to be done at all 8 of our schools. And we tried to do it in such a way that people would be able to look at the list and understand exactly what is going to be done. And we even, there were some acronyms, we're in education use a lot of acronyms that most people don't have a clue as to what the heck we're talking about. So there is a list of the actual names of each one of those acronyms, those abbreviations. The names are there for you all to understand. So, and what we'll do is we'll put that on the website so everyone can see, as of right now, and it may change between now and February, a list of all the work that's going to be done at all 8 of our buildings. So these are the things that we are really focusing our attention on, and there's a reason why those pictures are there. Alex Prignano, who has been, he's our business manager, and I'm sure most of you know Alex for the joy he brings to all of us. Alex and I recently went to, visited 2 elementary schools in Pawtucket, Potter Barnes and Nathaniel Green elementary schools. And these 2 schools have been totally renovated, and Torado Associates did the design work for those projects. They are beautiful. And we had a chance to see before and after pictures, but imagine your children going into classrooms like this. The one on the top is a totally renovated art room, and the one on the bottom is a new media center. So libraries of the future are going to look very different. In fact, classrooms in general are going to look very different because the whole focus of the classrooms of the 21st century, and we're already in year 18, is to provide collaborative learning opportunities for students and to do more project-based, hands-on learning for students. So these are just 2 examples of what we had an opportunity to see, and both schools are beautiful. And And just focusing on safety and security, and we've had many of these conversations at our PTO meetings, and we actually have a few more PTO meetings that we'll be conducting between now and the election on November 6th. We talk a lot about safety and security, and who would argue that we don't have a responsibility to do everything humanly possible to make our schools more safe. So all 8 of our schools, we're focusing on safety and security related items, and a good example is the entrance to all buildings. So there is vestibule work, that is the entrance to each building that is a part of each one of our projects. And you know what, the high school is a great example. I mean, the main foyer of the high school is beautiful. Who would argue that it's not and we do a lot of, we have lots of functions there because it is a beautiful place. Lots of glass, a big open area, but it's not the safest entryway that we should have. So part of the plan is to create a safer entryway, because think about this. Here's an example, and I'm not saying this to make anybody nervous, but for those of us that work in the building, and we pay, and there is always somebody stationed at the bottom of the stairs to pay attention to who is coming into the building, but anyone wanting to come into this building could get in those front doors, and then they actually have 7 places where they can go without being stopped by anybody. They could go as soon as they walk in. They could go, there's a corridor to the right, there's a corridor to the left, there's another angled corridor on either side of those 2 corridors off the main entrance. You can go up the stairs, you can go into the main office, and you can also go left or right when you get to the top of the stairs. So there are essentially 7 different places where you can go just by walking in that main entrance. So we have some work to do, not only here, not only this main entrance, but also the main entrance at all 8 of our schools. And we've already talked about all the needed upgrades and what have you. So there's a lot of work to be done, and it's pretty exciting that we have this opportunity, and we would like all of our schools to look like this. Okay, yeah, let me just, I think I pretty much have covered this. So we certainly need to pay more attention to 21st century learning environments. And you know, one of the things that I think is really hard for people to wrap their minds around, and I would include educators. And the only reason that I think I know more is because of all the work that we have done on this. But most of us, our idea of what schools should be like is based on our own experience as students, and for those of us that are in education, for our experiences as educators. So the challenge for us is to think about what it could be, or think about what it should be. So the question is, you know, we know that science, technology, engineering, and math are a main focus in this country. There are jobs, literally millions of jobs in this country that are unfilled because we do not have the skilled workers to fill them. So as educators, we have a responsibility to do more to prepare our students for those jobs, and we need to make sure that our facilities are able to meet that specific need. So there is, one of the incentives is really focused on creating STEM-related classrooms. And again, it's more of an opportunity for students to collaborate, where they can work together on projects and work in an environment where they have access to gas and water and electricity. I don't know that there are too many classrooms, science classrooms in this district that have all of those things. And we're not just talking about the high school. We're talking about elementary, middle, and high school. And one of the things, just to, to accentuate the difference between what we saw in those two elementary schools in Pawtucket, which are state-of-the-art schools now, and what we see in most elementary, middle, and high schools now is you still see lots and lots of rows of desks, not in all classrooms. And, I went to schools where there were rows of desks a long time ago. So there hasn't really been a whole lot of change in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. When you go to a place like this, there are no rows of desks. They're not set up that way. The whole design is to provide opportunities for students and staff, by the way, to collaborate. Enough said about that. Thank you for listening.
So the punchline really at the end of this is we hope that this has been helpful and gave some oversight and some information. I think the superintendent mentioned a few times, $83 million worth of work for $29 million. It really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us here in Cumberland and saves a tremendous amount of money for local taxpayers. The council has acted quickly, the school committees acted quickly, the General Assembly delegation acted quickly, and now it's before you, the voters. And so we ask for your support. But that's the conclusion of what we have, but certainly Superintendent Mitchell and I are available for any questions. So if there are any questions, we'll happily take them. Yeah? Yeah, the Cumberland bond provision that the council passed requires at least a 50% reimbursement rate. So without the state bond incentives, Cumberland's rate in the existing program is only 45%. So the incentives have to be part of it. So if the Cumberland bond passed, but the state one doesn't pass, it would basically be a negated bond, and it'd be dead on arrival likely. Yeah, the only way that would happen is if somehow we, in theory. If Senator Picard and I were really, really good, we could, in theory, maybe bump Cumberland's rate up to a 50% as a one-time thing for that bond or something. There may be a legislative way to handle that afterwards, but it'd be very, very complicated and difficult to do. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you got it.
I'm a parent. I have two children at Ashton School.
He wants you to wait for the mic.
Oh, sorry. I don't need a mic. I'm a teacher. Sorry. Oh, thank you. So I'm a parent of two children at Ashton School currently, and I have a third who's not yet in school and a public school teacher. Could you tell us if there are any of this money will be going to the charter schools or if it will stay with our schools in Cumberland?
That's a good question. So this is specifically related to the 8 Cumberland public schools. The charters are a separate and complete different LEA and funding entity on how school construction works. Yep.
Can I just say one thing that I think is really important? And generally when we have opportunities for parents to meet with us to talk about these kinds of things like this referendum, for example, and we've, like I said, already had, I think, 4 meetings with PTOs. And I think tonight is probably a good example as well. We usually get supporters, right? So we're usually preaching to the choir, right? But that's okay, because one of the things that we have talked about is how important it is now that you all are educated and have a better understanding than most folks who weren't able to come or didn't, take advantage of this opportunity. You can help us get the word out and provide folks in the community with accurate information about how this whole process works. So whatever you can do, using social media or, conversations with friends about this opportunity and make sure that they have accurate information would be really, really helpful.
I would just like to ask if solar was talked about for even just including in classrooms for STEM to keep the bills down, maybe. Representative
Marzlikowski is hot to trot on that issue. It is not currently in the plan, but I think that's one of the things that we need to consider. And you know what? People are going to probably be upset with me for even saying this, but one of the things that has come up is, do we want to provide at least more air conditioning than was see, that's what happens. People start making noises when you talk about that because it's expensive, right? So the question is, like, I mean, should we consider that? I mean, especially with like the kind of weather that we had for the start of the school year. I mean, it would, just so that you know, it would cost a phenomenal amount of money for us to put air conditioning in all of our buildings. I don't know that that is economically feasible, but certainly, we, I think, need to have conversations about what we can do to make sure that students have a comfortable learning environment. 85 degrees in a classroom or 89 degrees in a classroom is not the ideal learning environment. So whatever we can do, and we've already started having conversations about some other potential options. But see, I believe that as a school system, we have a responsibility to consider those kinds of things, like solar. So that'll probably be added to the list of things for us to consider before February. And it might happen anyway, because we have some, like Representative Marzolkowski, as I said, is like, I know that that's something that he has been talking about for some time.
You can't tell them how much it will cost.
It was really a quote. I just want to add something, if I may, in that the reimbursable incentives that the senator and the superintendent talked about are not all of the ones that are available. You can, as part of the Rhode Island Department of Education approval process, one of the checkoffs that we need to meet is addressing and meeting with the local electric utility, and they provide incentives that are going to get us more efficient systems, but also that's when we would address the solar panels and items like that, and we fully intend to do that.
Thank you, Louis.
First of all, thank you again for all your work and everybody's work who's been involved in this. But I've been in the town for about 30 years, and the maintenance of the schools and the condition of the schools has always been a major issue.
Yeah.
So with this amount of money being put into the school from the town and the state,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is there any incentive that's been put in from the state to say these things have to be maintained so that the school committee,
That is
is responsible for doing that?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, and one that I think is really, really important. The last thing we wanted to do was for the state to make an investment of this size and have communities match that investment, and then 10 years from now, we're back where we started, right? So as part of the provisions going forward, there are minimum budget requirements that the school districts will have to spend on maintenance of the facilities on a go-forward basis. So that is in the legislation. It is part of the statute, and it's something that we worked on with the Superintendent's Association, the School Committees Association, to sort of come to an agreement on that. But I do think it's really important, and with my school committee colleagues in here, we really have to plan for that, right? Because, it has to become one of those sacred buckets that you can't touch. And the way that it's structured in the legislation is that if you don't meet it, that puts your reimbursements at risk. And so the penalties would be way worse than not making the financial commitment to maintain the schools. And so sort of a carrot and a stick approach to it. Yep. Yep.
Okay, so I'm a parent who has not been involved through this whole thing, so I always feel guilty. I'm coming up now being like, oh, I should go figure out what this is all about. And
That's what we're here for.
I guess I come from this very fiscal conservative thought process. So can you just explain to me the incentives and this pay-go, or
Yes.
whatever the acronym,
Yep.
how come they have to be tied to this bond? Those are brilliant ideas,
Yep.
obviously. So
Yeah.
the
So-
tie to the bond?
The short, so I'll give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is the state would not have the capital in our hands to be able to give school communities the incentives and pay for all this stuff without the state bond, right? So we just don't have $250 million lying around in cash, unfortunately. Senator Picard's been looking for it for a few years. But he hasn't found it yet. He'll update us all if he figures it out. So we don't have that kind of cash sitting around. And so the $250 million is the upfront capital that we're going to use, and that's part of it. The complicated part of this is, so it's $83 million worth of work, right? There's a state share, which is 65% of the cost, which is $54 million, right? Then there's a local share, which is the 29 million, right? The local share is going to be completely funded by Cumberland local taxpayers and part of our normal debt service, right? So the CHS 2010 bonds, for example, that was a $30 million issuance that happened, and those roll off. And so one of the things that municipalities look at all the time is they look at their debt service payments. And typically, as you retire debt, you can afford to add new debt for the police station, roads, right? There's another $2.5 million on the ballot this year for Cumberland for roads and those sorts of things. The complication of the state share, right, is so our state share is $54 million, right? To give you context, we're one of 8 communities going forward for reimbursement under these new incentives this year, right? So we moved really fast, but 7 others moved fast with us, right? And some of those communities are going out for $200 or over $200 million worth of work. They're bigger communities, and they also haven't done some of the work that we have done over the years to maintain our facilities, and we have done better than Pawtucket, for example, in some of that work. So the state is going to have to say, all the applications that come in, what's the total state obligation? So for Cumberland, it's $54 million. For Pawtucket, maybe it's $170 million. For, East Providence, they're building a new high school, and their bond is, I think, over $200 million as well. The state's going to have to look at that and say, how can we afford to pay for that? The first place we're going to go look is that $250 million worth of capital and upfront money that we can then allocate to those projects. We won't be able to pay the full state share for every project, but we'll be able to pay a good amount of it. And since we're paying so much of it up front, when we get to the reimbursement of it on the back edge, it's less on the reimbursement side of the back edge, and it lowers the financing costs over the long haul. Does that make sense? Okay. Yep. Yeah, it's really around having that cash to be able to do the upfront payment, because that upfront payment reduces what the city. So if we have no upfront payment, Cumberland has to. The reason the bond question is worst case scenario. If we had no upfront payment from the state, we would have to bond the full 83, right? And then the state would reimburse us as we make those bond payments. If the state gives us, say, $20 million, right, and we only have to bond 63, obviously it's a lower bond payment on the back end. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, we did. Yeah, that's a good question. So we listed the 4 bigger incentives that are happening here. There's actually 7 incentive categories, I believe, and I'm looking for Lewis to give me the nod. Yeah, there's 7 categories that are worth 5 points apiece. You only can get up to, if you hit all 7, you're only getting 20 points anyway, so you max out at 4. But one of the incentive categories is called fewer and newer. And the idea behind that is particularly in some communities that may have 7 elementary schools and they don't really need 7, they need 5 now, rather than renovate 7 and change 7. There's actually incentives in there that if they basically put the kibosh on old schools and build new, there's an incentive point that they'd be awarded to do that. Not as part of any of the work that was initially done. I don't know if you want to take that.
I don't know if this is a good example, but one of the things that Louis Torado and I talked about recently was, is it more cost effective to build a new school or renovate an existing school? And it was pretty clear that it would be more cost effective to renovate an existing than to build a new one. And if you had a chance to see these 2 schools that we visited, if someone told you that they were brand spanking new, you would believe it. I mean, that is how beautiful they are and how well it was done at an incredible, I think, a real reasonable cost. And it would have probably cost, double or triple what it cost to renovate it.
And I think the other thing too that's unique about Cumberland is especially we have 8 schools, right? 5 are elementary, and 5 of the elementary are basically at capacity. We don't have excess capacity to close down and save, right? Newport's a good example. They had multiple different elementaries, but they had more much more capacity than they needed. So they would have been renovating 2 schools that are way too big for the population they had to serve. And so instead they closed them down and they created 1 new elementary school. And then the irony of that, just I have to share, is they did that school, and as soon as they made that school a brand new school that people are proud to go to, they assumed some bump in enrollment because students would come back into the traditional school district. They missed the number. So there's that many more kids that came back into the school system and wanted to be in Newport schools because of the facility. Yeah. All right, any other questions? Yep, no, go for it.
When you talk about the idea of the, 21st century classrooms and that, is there any type of incentive balancing out the, teacher education and teacher training to go along with that effort in the physical plant of the schools?
I think that's a great question. So not only do we need to create learning environments that will better prepare students for the work, that they will be actually applying for. In fact, we say this all the time, and it is true that students in the high school right now are going to be applying for jobs that haven't even been created yet. So we need to provide them with the skill set to be able to adapt to those kinds of things. So there's no question that professional development has to be a part of this process. It will not be included in the money that we need for facilities, but our responsibility is to ensure that teachers are getting the training, for example, to do more project-based learning. So we are really paying it. That is a definite trend. And for those of us who have been in education for a long time, and when you have conversations with students who are more actively engaged in learning and who are doing more project-based kinds of learning, that is the learning that really sticks. So, we will be definitely providing more professional development to prepare teachers for more project-based learning in their classrooms.
I think one thing that comes out of this presentation I think is really important to remember is that while the 21st century learning is key and it's critical and it's something we're looking to get out of this, there are literally tens of millions of dollars in upgrades and replacements that have to be done in these buildings regardless. These buildings were built, they were built well, but everything has a life expectancy, everything has an age. We're going to have to replace the boilers in these buildings at some point. We're going to have to replace the plumbing systems, the electrical systems. There is no choice. The opportunity that we have here because of the incentives that the state has created is to be able to do that for the taxpayers in Cumberland far less expensively than it would be if we wait until these things are at utter failure. One of the reasons that we don't have to do this everywhere is the town has invested millions of dollars in upgrading. We don't have to replace the boilers in Garvin. We don't have to replace them in BF Norton because we've done that work. But we're going to have to do it elsewhere. These aren't choices. This is like having a roof in your house. After 25 or 30 years, you're going to have to replace it. But if at the 15-year mark somebody came over to you and said, hey, I'll let you do it now and you'll pay 40 cents on the dollar, that's the time to do it. And I think that's part of what we need to understand here is that if we don't take advantage of this opportunity, we're still going to be replacing boilers in a few years. We're still going to be replacing roofs. We're still going to be replacing elevators. It's just the cost of doing business. We have 8 buildings. This is what we're going to have to do. The great opportunity we have here is to share some of that cost and take advantage of the financing that the state has put in place for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, so many of the central systems, they may last another 5 years, but they're beyond their usable life by 20 already, right? And so I think that's a real piece that the state's process is called the necessity of school construction, because part of the phase 1 and the phase 2 applications is that you go through and you basically have, hey, here are the needs that we have. And you could see it in the Jacobs report, which was, commissioned by the state. to committee member Hess's point, is, tens of millions of, the electrical system is too old. The plumbing needs to be repaired. The roof's going to fall. I mean, those are the sorts of things that we don't want to happen, and rather wait until we have no heat at North Cumberland Middle School and someone calls me. Then we want to make sure we're in that position.
I just wanted to point out, too, that how essential this is. I'm in the real estate business, and when people are looking to buy a home, one of that is schools. And if you have a good school department with viable facilities that are not functionally obsolete, like some other communities have, that's a real benefit for all homeowners in the town. We're fortunate that we have the academic portion of things, and the athletic facilities in Cumberland are recognized statewide. We have more, we're just talking about this at the PTO, more AP classes in Cumberland than some of the neighboring towns. That's a benefit. Something like this will really, in addition to being good for fiscal reasons, maintaining properties, it'll be good for the students, but it'll be good for property values across the town. So that's like a kind of a big marketing flag. So selfishly, I mean, we should all support it.
Couldn't agree more. Any other questions about that? No? One of the things Superintendent Mitchell just mentioned to me, he said, we are one of the first, 8 communities to take advantage of this, and I certainly think that's an additional advantage to Cumberland, right, to be on the forefront. And certainly from a marketing perspective, Cumberland leaders were the first at the table, and that's how serious I take schools. I think will work as a good message. But I think the other part of that too is, things always change, and I think the 20 incentive points are on the table for Cumberland now. They may not be in 2 years. They may not be in the future. Right? There's an expiration on these, but before the expiration, they could change. The 20 points is on the table today. We were lucky enough that Cumberland had already done a stage 1 application a couple of years or a year ago or so that had a lot of this initial work done, and we were able to move as quickly as we could. But this truly is a once in a lifetime opportunity for Cumberland, and certainly to Superintendent Mitchell's earlier point, we want to just ask for your support, but also ask for you to help spread the word to neighbors and friends throughout the community. So thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for coming tonight.